All right, now that we've come through and we agree that the Earth was created as a giant ball of lava that cooled, how did life begin? Okay, and life beginning is actually as complicated as the Earth beginning, because again, when the Earth was created, nobody had Snapchat or Facebook Live or anything to record this stuff, so it was really difficult. Furthermore, uh, there was this idea that imagine all the water on the earth, okay, all the oceans or the lakes or the rivers or the streams was built up, right? It was the water that's on the earth now was always on the earth. Okay, the carbon that was always on the earth was always on the earth. Like everything that is on the earth now has always been here, except for the few things that are brought in by meteorites or asteroids. So if the earth is really, really hot, that means all the water on the earth is actually in the air. Okay, it's actually in a cloud, airborne as rain, that sort of thing, right? So when the Earth first started, then you really have a planet that was too hot to have liquid water. So how does life begin in such an environment? How does life begin in such conditions? And one of the theories that came out was this two scientists called Miller and Urey, and they created this design. The idea was you take the ocean, right? It's not really an ocean, but you're taking the water that is in the earth and you're boiling it and you're making it into gaseous water, right? Water vapor. And then uh, when you take this water vapor and you funnel it through, you put a bunch of the chemicals that were around in the atmosphere at that time, things like ammonia, methane, stuff like that, right? And there was no oxygen that, as far as we believe at that time. And then they have electrodes, and these electrodes simulate something that makes sense now is lightning. You might be like, why is there lightning? Well, think about it. When there's a bad storm here, we have a lot of lightning. Now imagine what a bad storm would be like if every drop of water on Earth was airborne, right? That would be a horrendous storm all over the place. So this then would be a very active element. And then they put out the chemicals they thought was around back then, and they ran all this water vapor through here, and electricity, electricity, electricity. And then what they did was they let it kind of condense a little bit. As it cooled, the water would, well, lack of a better word, it would rain inside of this chamber. And then they ran cool water through this part of the glass so that it would condense further and further. And then this is a sampling container, a sample tube. And they would get some of the liquid that ran through this process, and they would see what was grown, what was created, what came about there, what could they find there, right? And what they found was things like amino acids, things like nucleotides, things like monosaccharides. These are the building blocks of sugars, amino acids, and nucleic acids. So, I'm sorry, building blocks of sugars, right, or carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. So, with that, if you're able to build these organic things and build them up from the conditions that are on Earth, then the idea is, well, maybe these things kind of spontaneously came about. The meteorite hypothesis, it's not much of a hypothesis. We found amino acids on meteorites. So meteorites have landed on Earth. We looked inside of the meteorite and we found amino acids. Now, the question could be, well, who put them there, right? Sure. Or how did they develop there? Like what caused them to grow or develop or be created there? Or where did they come from that amino acids existed, right? There's really no way to know the answer to that question, but we found them there. And then you have another set of ideas that talks about, well, how did you get the first cell, right? So if you got these amino acids and these nucleotides and these monosaccharides, and maybe we got them from meteorites, and maybe we got them from the Miller-Urey like environment. Well, how does it become a cell? Right. Well, there's lots of ideas with this. There are these things called vesicles. They are like, think of like little bubbles of fat, and there's some bubbles of fat that if you get some of these nucleic acids and sugars and stuff into them, they'll act like a cell. Uh, Also, iron sulfide bubbles could act like the boundary of a cell. So, in the end, some kind of bubble had to come into play here. Now, whether it was one bubble or another or multiple bubbles, it really doesn't make a difference, right? So, the lipid membrane was the one I was just talking about, the iron sulfur. So, some kind of barrier has to come in to protect what's inside from what's outside. The last piece here that really needs to play a role is you need to have some kind of hereditary and uh, and like benefit. Okay, so RNA is the idea that these first cells had because it's the simplest. Remember, it's single stranded instead of double stranded, and it can duplicate itself, so it can make a copy of itself. You know, remember if you're a lipid and you run into another lipid and that's part of your membrane, it'll incorporate and you get a bigger bubble. Almost like that game you guys play where it's like a bubble, and as you run over smaller bubbles, you get bigger and bigger. Lipid membranes do that same thing. As you are a bubble and you start going and you capture other bubbles, you'll get bigger and bigger. Except no one's driving this bubble; it's just kind of floating around. The RNA can actually do some stuff. It can make some chemical reactions faster, and if you can make some chemical reactions faster and pass on your genetics and copy yourself and do all that stuff, well, now you're considered like a living thing, and that's enough to consider yourself a living thing. Later on, you could become DNA, like the DNA can replace the RNA, but at first it would just be RNA. And that's all you're going to need to know for chapter 12, section 3.